Hello, Mrs. Jeffrey, the designing woman here. We're getting ready to start an adventure in learning about art. I hope you've packed your tool bag and are ready to learn some terms and ideas that are going to help us. There will be things that you want to remember, so I'd suggest that you get a notebook and pencil and be ready to jot down some of these things as we go along. Pause the video here and go get them. I'll wait. You're back again, I see. Let's get started. When we talk about art in our study, we're going to need words that'll help us understand each other when we're talking about what we see. There are several ways to talk about art, but one of the most important things is knowing the general category of art that you're looking at. When we look at a work that an artist has made where he has done his best to make his work look like the world that he sees, painting so that it looks just like what he's looking at, or what he's imagining looks as if it were real. We call this kind of painting realistic or representational painting. Now, there are ways that you can look at this and say, well, that's not exactly like a photograph, but even as a painting, it will still represent the real world. Did you notice the words represent and real? Those are our clues that what we're looking at is representational art or realistic art. Let's look at 4 pictures that will explain what we're talking about when we look at realistic or representational pictures. Raphael Sanji Oh painted this portrait of Baldassare Castiglione. While this isn't a photograph, we can be fairly certain that Mr. Castiglione probably looked like this. It is a realistic representation of a man by the artist Sonzo. Oh. Joseph Turner painted this picture called The Slave Ship. You can recognize the ship, and if you look very closely, there are other things that look a lot like the real world around us. Turner painted loosely, so his picture isn't super realistic and like a photograph, but you can recognize what he is trying to represent. André Derain made a picture of London Bridge. Wow! The real sky isn't usually orange, and I doubt that the water under London Bridge is really this color. But you can recognize what Derain was painting: real buildings, bridge, sky, and water. So, we would talk about all 3 of these pictures as realistic or representational. Some artists make art in which you do not recognize anything in the artwork. It's so changed from realistic image that it needs a lot of careful looking to decide what the artist might have intended. We call this kind of art either abstract or non-objective. Abstract means it has no reference to a specific object. The term non-objective, like it sounds, has no object it is portraying. Let's look at 4 paintings that illustrate what we mean when we call art either abstract or non-objective. Vasily Kandinsky painted this picture called Improvisation 28. It is a very energetic and colorful painting. There are lots of shapes to see, but none really look like Kandinsky was trying to paint any particular object that he was looking at. Hans Hoffman's picture, Effervescence, is a lively work that has nothing in it that looks like anything we see in the natural world or the real world. You do get some very interesting feelings and thoughts when you look at it, but it certainly isn't a photograph. Barnett Newman created these enormous panel paintings called Vir Heroica Sublimis. As you can see, the painting is very subtle. If you could see it in real life, it has lines and subtle changes in color, but it definitely is non-objective. Ellsworth Kelly painted Red, Blue, Green. This painting is a large areas of color in various shapes. Kelly is not trying to portray anything realistic. Rather, he has made an abstract painting. When we come to the second thing we need to know when we look at think about art, we have to have some terms that I call, or many people call, the elements of art. We are going to use the following 7 elements to be able to analyze and think about and use words to talk about pictures and other kinds of art as carefully as we possibly can. Those 7 things are line, shape, space, texture, form, value, color. Let's look at each one in turn. Here is where you will want to take some notes. Line is a continuous mark that defines space, outlines, or shows movement or texture. Let's look at how lines work in 3 pictures. You remember the picture that Raphael Sanji Oh painted of Baldassare Castiglione? Can you see in here the line that defines the outside edge of Mr. Castiglione's right sleeve? The lines that define his fingers? Note how Sanji Oh has used implied lines that using the contrast between very light places and very dark places, like the edge of his hat and the background. Martin Schongauer created this engraving called The Temptation of St. Anthony. He has used lots of lines to define spaces, but most obviously he has created a vivid sense of action and movement with his use of lines. Vasily Kandinsky painted Improvisation 28 that we looked at earlier. Notice how he defines shapes using line. He used lines to direct our eyes all around the painting. Many of the lines are repeated, with some of them thick, some of them thin. All of the lines seem very active and energetic. Shape, geometric or organic enclosed flat shape or space, two-dimensional, with a length and width bounded by other elements of art. Now, negative space is what surrounds a shape, and it is a shape all of its own. Let's look at 2 paintings with shape in mind. I'm going to look at Sanji Oh's painting again, Mr. Baldassare Castiglione. Do you notice the shape of his white shirt front? It's bounded by the edges of his coat. Do you notice the shape of his hat? If you were to outline it, what shape would you have? That's right, an upside-down crescent with a notch in the outside edge. The negative space in this picture is what you would call the background. The entire area that isn't the figure of Mr. Castiglione is the negative shape in this picture. Martin Schongauer's Temptation of St. Anthony is filled with different shapes. Can you see what are in his drawing? There's arms, legs, claws, wings. Do you notice the negative spaces created between the creatures and St. Anthony's robes? Between the legs of the creature grasping St. Anthony's left arm? Space, the creation of a feeling of depth or 3 dimensions through the use of lines and shapes, color, or size of objects. 2 pictures here will help us understand how artists do this. In this painting by Sanji Oh, who also painted the portrait we've been looking at, we have a strong sense of 3 dimensions. It's called the School of Athens. The area around the old philosophers where they're walking is made very real looking by Sonzo in his use of what is called perspective. He has used angled lines on the tiles of the floor so that they look as if they were receding away from us. See how the upright lines of the walls get shorter and closer together as they near the arch in the center behind the philosophers? That makes the room look as if we could walk right up to them, as if we were in a 3-dimensional space. Still Life with Peaches is an amazing wall painting from Herculaneum. It was a town that was inundated by an eruption of a volcano nearly 2,000 years ago. In this picture, we see that the artist has used different values of the reddish-brown color to create the illusion of 2 shelves that the peaches and glass jar are sitting on. The shape of the shadow from the jar also gives the idea of realistic 3-dimensional space or shape. Texture is the surface quality of an object. It can be actual touchable surface, rough, smooth, bumpy, coarse, scratchy, or texture can be painted or drawn in such a way as if to look as if it were really textured. Can you see in this painting by Jean-Francois Millet called The Gleaners how Millet used light color short strokes of paint to make the stubble of the grass stalks in the foreground? Can't you just imagine how uncomfortable it would be to walk barefoot in this field? Millet has created very believable texture. Here's a drawing of elephants in which the artist has used lines and light and dark shading to help us know how tough and wrinkled the skin of these elephants is. Here is another drawing that makes us feel with our eyes the rough bark of the log and the scratchy texture of grasses. Don't the eggs look smooth? Even though they are speckled, the artist has made them believable as smooth eggs. Form, a 3D figure that has mass and a height and a width and a depth. A sculptor named Donatello created this enormous statue called Gattamelata. It stands in a city square. If you were there, you would be able to wrap your arms around one of the horse's legs. If you could climb up that high, the statue's on a very high pedestal. Can you see that the figure has height, depth, width? We use the word form only when talking about three-dimensional artwork. Value, the brightness or darkness of a color. High-value colors are close to white, and low-value colors are close to black. We call high-value colors tints because they are created by adding white, and colors that are created adding black are called shades. Here's a value scale. Notice that it steps from white to black in 10 steps. And here is a color value scale. Can you see how the red at the top is nearly white? That end is said to be a high value. The end that is dark, nearly black, is a low value of the color red. Color is the visual perception of the spectrum of light. There are three colors which cannot be made by mixing together any other colors. They are called the primary colors. They are red, blue, and yellow. When the primary colors are mixed together in equal proportions, they create what we call the secondary colors. Blue and yellow will make green. Red and blue will make purple, or some people call it violet. Yellow and red will make orange. When we mix any of the primary colors together in various proportions, we can get any other color. We're going to discuss this and put our hand to actually painting and making a color wheel in our studio project. There are also three properties of color that we are going to use terms to help describe color, and it's important that we get a hold of these as well. As we look at this basics of the color wheel here, you'll notice that there's a band called hue. The word hue is used to describe pure color that has no black or white added. Look at the band labeled hues. Each color is clear and distinct. It is not mixed with white or black or any other color. The term intensity is used to describe the dullness or vividness of a color. Do you see the difference between the orange in the band labeled hue and the orange in the band labeled shade? Notice how vivid the one is compared to the other. This difference is the intensity of a color. Value is the term we use to describe the lightness or darkness of a color. Compare the bands labeled tints and shades. Can you see the lightness of the blue in the tints band compared to the blue in the shades band? In the weeks ahead, we're going to be doing some studio exercises to learn more about these elements. And now, there's one last thing we need to get to know. A work of art can be analyzed using the elements we've just talked about, but we also need to understand how to think about the artist's overall plan. We call this plan the composition. How has the artist composed his piece? What is the viewer's eye first drawn to see? That place is called the focal point, or the center of interest. How has the artist coaxed your eye to this focal point? Often it's the brightest or most detailed part of the painting. There may be lines, actual lines, or implied lines, or suggested lines that work like subtle arrows aimed at the focal point. To have a satisfying composition, the artist plans the most effective placement for the focal point and all the lines and shapes that focus the viewer there. There's a tool that was invented by an ancient architect called Phidias. He lived in Greece, and he scientifically devised and described the classic standards and proportions that are still used today. He wrote about and put into practice in his architectural designs what became known as the golden mean. By using the placement suggested by the mathematical grid using Phidias's formula, the artist puts his focal point in a place that is most visually arresting. We will discuss this in more detail when we study the art of Greece. Those of you who love math will find that a very interesting lesson. You may hear other terms used to analyze composition of a painting. Some use what is called the rule of thirds, which divides the picture in thirds, both horizontally and vertically. The golden section uses a mathematical formula to place the same four lines in a slightly different way. The spiral section and the golden section are both based on the proportions of the seashell called a nautilus. We'll find that proportion and sequence repeated over and over in nature. So there, you have the main tools that we need to understand or make art. Let's review our terms. Realistic or representational art. Abstract or non-objective art. Line, shape, space, texture, form, value, color, composition, focal point, golden mean. See you soon in our first class. We'll make a quick review of these things and get set for a great year studying art. Goodbye.